At some point towards the end of the Middle Minoan II period, Crete once again suffered from its geography. Earthquakes, probably multiple, struck the island sometime before 1700 BC. Destruction can be found at most sites and is often accompanied by fire, a sign of social unrest or potentially intra-regional conflicts during the chaotic transition period. Phaistos was one of the palaces which seemed to have suffered the most in terms of destruction, and in the succeeding period stood vacant for long before being partially rebuilt and reoccupied. Malia, as well as the surrounding town, also saw a period of destruction intermingled by fire during the same period. There is, however, one exception, that is Knossos. Unlike the other palaces, Knossos show no sign of major destruction or widespread fire. Some destruction can still be observed, but whatever form of destruction which afflicted Knossos during this transition period was very limited. Instead, there is much continuation from the previous periods, an indication of major new construction projects. The fact that Knossos seems nearly unimpacted by the destruction also means that Knossos enters the Neopalatial with an advantage over other areas around Crete. It is not surprising that in the political vacuum caused by the destructive episode at the end of the Protopalatial, Knossos develops into a leading political, economic and cultural center on Crete, while other sites try to recover. During the Protopalatial, Phaistos and Knossos had been the two major centers around central Crete, but without Phaistos, Knossos would alone become the regional hegemon of central Crete. The Neopalatial, or New Palace period, is the zenith of Minoan civilization, but also the last truly Minoan period on Crete. The initial ceramic phase of the Neopalatial, the Middle Minoan III period, shows little sign of occupation around the palaces at both Malia and Phaistos. The Middle Minoan III is in many ways a transitional period from the old to the new palace, a difficult intermezzo which has been placed both in the Proto and Neopalatial period by different authors. At times even called the pre-palatial Neopalatial, so the period before the new palaces. It is positioned after the destruction of the old palaces, but also before the construction of many of the new palaces. It is a very short period in Minoan history. In total, the Middle Minoan III A and B consist of less than a century, probably sometime around the interval of 1750 to 1700 BC, or possibly as late as 1675 BC, although there are numerous other suggestions. In general, the Middle Minoan III is a poorly understood period, and the various dates and chronology suggested for the period shows the difficulty inherent in establishing an archaeological chronology. Some even suggest that the period is far too brief to be considered its own period, as evidence from the Middle Minoan III were nearly exclusively found at Knossos up until recently. Conveniently, however, we put the Middle Minoan III period as part of the Neopalatial period, and this is certainly true for Knossos, where we see the construction of some of the characteristic elements of the new palace. In a sense, the Neopalatial culture is formed at Knossos during the Middle Minoan III A, before these ideals were exported to other areas around Crete during the Middle Minoan III B. The one unexpected development of the Middle Minoan III B period is the construction of a new palace. Located just southeast of Knossos, the small palace of Galatas was constructed during the Middle Minoan III B period, adjacent to a thriving and wealthy town of the same name. Galatas would have been a small palatial state, probably under the influence of Knossos, in a very similar way as Monastiraki was to Phaistos during the Protopalatial, which might explain why the palace could be constructed during such a chaotic chapter in Minoan history. The palace at Galatas was chiefly a regional, administrative, political and religious center for southeast central Crete. It probably exercised some degree of autonomy, but given the close connection in form and construction along with similarities in pottery and frescoes, Galatas would ultimately have been a dependent of Knossos. At Phaistos, some efforts were undertaken to reconstruct parts of the palace during the Middle Minoan III A, but only partial parts of the palace were actually inhabited, and some administrative activity was once again undertaken in the palace. But truly only at a rudimentary scale, given the limited number of seals found from the period. In the northern parts of Phaistos, the workshops were partially in use again, and it is presumed that it is under the Middle Minoan IIIa that the Phaistos disk, which we have discussed previously, was produced. A disk of undeciphered signs, which are often assumed to have constituted a form of religious chant, potentially connected to the destructive episode from the end of the Protopalatial period. But whatever was rebuilt was sadly quickly destroyed by yet another earthquake at the end of the Middle Minoan IIIa, leaving the palace at Phaistos in ruins once again. Although the derelict palace saw some use during the late Minoan Ia, many argue that the new palace was not completed until the late Minoan Ib, so during the 16th century BC. The effort of rebuilding Malia, which had suffered widespread fire damage around the end of the Middle Minoan IIb, had also began quite quickly after its destruction. But it would take until the end of the Middle Minoan before the Neopalatial palace was finalized, sometimes during the transition from the Middle to Late Minoan. If the Neopalatial period is the zenith of Minoan civilization, the Late Minoan Ia is the most developed period of the Neopalatial. The palaces were rebuilt, except for at Phaistos, where the palace still hadn't fully recovered. Most towns had grown to their largest sizes, and artisan production, both in the palace workshops and rural hamlets, flourished. Central Crete seemed to have come under the control of Knossos, with Phaistos, Ayatriada, Galatas, and Tylissos all operating under the control of the palace authority at Knossos. Palaces and settlements outside of central Crete, however, remained somewhat independent, but were probably still closely connected and dependent on Knossos, especially in terms of culture. The multiple mountain ranges and valleys made it difficult for any single authority to control the whole island through force, but not through culture. Crete during the Neopalatial had become incredibly stratified, both socially and politically. In terms of political organization, the palace was the central power in the region, but they were also the religious center and were often situated near a religious peak or cave sanctuary. So it is easy to forget that the palace itself was the central administrative building of the surrounding town. The palace did not exist in isolation, but had a nearby urban population which lived outside the palace and made up a large majority of the populace. Some towns across Crete, without a palace, were of sufficient size to rival that of the major palace centers, which means that towns without a palace could be important regional urban centers as well. Around the palaces we find various small villages which administered the local hamlets, farmhouses and shepherds' huts, which could be found around the region. The small villages were key features in the Minoan landscape and constituted an important part in the greater trade network, which brought various foods, tools, wines, textiles and oils to the palaces. As the urban population on Crete was very large, with palaces such as Knossos potentially reaching an urban population of nearly 50,000 individuals, taxing and securing the production of food was of tantamount importance. To secure control over and efficiently administer the smaller regions, most villages had a villa constructed close to the local village center. The villa was basically an extension of the palace in the countryside, a form of mini-palace acting as the local administrative center, making sure that taxes were collected, areas surveyed, and assets, such as cattle or sheep, counted. The inhabitants of the villa would have been officials of the palace, constituting a part of the palace aristocracy, embracing palace aesthetics, culture, and fashion. We see these types of villas popping up all over Crete, using ashlar masonry with large cut rectangular stone pieces. These villas were often 2 stories and imitated the architecture of the palace. For example, the villa at Vertipetro is often regarded as a prime example of the Neopalatial villa. It sits just south of Mount Euctas, overlooking a fertile wine-producing region, which today is the center of wine production on Crete, and would probably have been a great producer of wine during the Neopalatial. We know from the finds at the villa that it did not only function as an administrative centre, but also as a place for production. Various tools and vessels connected to the pressing of wine and olive oil have been found along with various vessels for agricultural storage. The various presses found at the site were used in the production of both wine and oils, which were pressed and placed in the large vats before being strained through funnels and strainers. The finalized product, such as wines, olive oils, and aromatic oils, were then deposited into various storage containers depending on the nature of the product. Not all resources necessary to maintain the palace economy could be found on Crete, and the Neopalatial administration once again had to look away from the island to maintain a steady supply of metals. The Minoan relationship with the Cycladic islands would turn from mutual trade partners during the Protopalatial to increased Minoan control under the Neopalatial period. Minoan key interest around the Cyclades was, as it had been during the Protopalatial period, the rich metal resources from the Lavrion mine on Attica. At the adjacent island of Kea, the nearby metals from Lavrion had resulted in a culture of metalworking, with skilled artisans importing metals such as copper, silver and lead across the strait, before producing wares which were exported far and wide. During the Middle Minoan III period, Neopalatial Minoan pottery started to show up at Aegean, the main settlement of the island, but also at other sites around the Cyclades, namely Philocopi on Melos and Akrotiri on Thera, modern-day Santorini. The Minoanization of Akrotiri is probably the best known example of exported Minoan culture outside Crete. The inhabitants incorporated Minoan architectural features in new construction projects. We can see various examples of Minoan halls, lustral basins and ashlar masonry at the town. At one of the better excavated and preserved houses at Akrotiri, the so-called Sesti III, we can see some of the remains of Minoan-inspired palace architecture, especially the use of ashlar masonry is noticeable. The pier and door partition can be seen used at various points around the town, which is a staple of Minoan architecture. Just to the right we can see another example of pier and door partition, which is the side entrance to a Minoan hall. We can see the structure quite well on the map, with various columns arranged in a square formation. Looking from the north, we can partially see the Minoan hall, with the piers hidden behind the remaining structure. We can see the remaining columns, which outlines the Minoan hall, as well as part of the adjacent lustral basin. It can be difficult to get a great view of the exact features, but the important takeaway is the state of Minoanization at Akrotiri around the late Minoan 1a. Minoan influence can be found in most aspects of life at Akrotiri, from cult items such as this bull rhython, a common Minoan cult symbol, the use of linear A documents, adoption of the potter's wheel, creation of a nearby peak sanctuary, similar textile production with loom weights on a standing loom, and the adaptation of Minoan nature motifs found in both sealed glyptic and frescoes. There are many indications which would have made it quite probable that Akrotiri was at some point colonized during the Neopalatial period, but it is far more probable that the inhabitants of Akrotiri were local Therans who had quickly incorporated many Minoan features into their daily life. There is no sign of hostility, no sudden destruction before the cultural shift, which would indicate that the shift was forced upon the Therans through violence. The same cannot be said of the town of Aegean on Kea. The walls and part of the town was destroyed by the end of the Middle Minoan III period, and the new structures which are built after the destruction have various Minoan architectural features. The town started to use Minoan linear A script, painted frescoes with Minoan motifs, and engaged in Minoan cult activities. Aegean was not alone in having been suddenly destroyed around the end of the Middle Minoan III period. At Melos, the island famous for its source of obsidian, the small town of Philokopi experienced the same cultural shift towards a Minoan way of life after a short period of destruction. The three Cycladic islands of Thera, Melos, and Kia are key nodes in a greater network of trade which secured a steady flow of metals to Crete. This route from Crete along the Cyclades to the rich mines of Lavrion had been dubbed the Western String, and was probably the most important trade route during the Neopalatial, and undoubtedly the reason why towns like Aegian, Philokopi, and Akrotiri became so deeply incorporated into the Minoan culture. Ancient authors often describe Minos, the mythological king of Knossos, which Evans named the Minoans after, at the hands of a powerful navy which ruled the Aegean, what is often referred to as a thalassocracy, a sea empire, a maritime power which dominates both politics and trade through a powerful navy. Thucydides, the famous Athenian historian who is our greatest source of the Second Peloponnesian War, retells some of the history of the Aegean world and mentions Minos, stating, "Minos is the earliest of those known to tradition who established a navy. He took control of most of what is now called the Hellenic Sea, and ruled over the Cycladic islands, in most in which he found the first colonies, driving out the Carians, the people of southwestern Anatolia, and installing his own sons as governors. And naturally, he set about clearing the sea of piracy as far as he could, to protect his own increasing revenue." The mention of a king on Crete, the mythological king Minos, is not an indication that there existed a king of the Neopalatial period on Crete. Instead, the reference to a king Minos has more to do with Greek mythology and Crete during the Mycenaean period, a far later period, when parts of Crete were under the rule of the mainland Helladic cultures, chiefly the Mycenaeans. What Thucydides indicate is that Crete at one point, in the minds of the later Greek cultures, had dominated much of the Aegean, colonized parts of the Cyclades, tracked down on piracy, and controlled much of trade. It is very probable that this is a reference to the Minoan expansion around the Aegean Sea during the Neopalatial period. In the eastern Aegean, we also find similar evidence of Minoan colonies on the west coast of Anatolia. Minoan interest in the towns around the Anatolian coast is quite understandable, given the close connection between these towns and goods from the Near East. The Assyrian trade network brought various resources and luxury goods from Mesopotamia west towards Anatolia, eventually reaching the towns on the Anatolian west coast. Minoan interest in towns like Iasos and Miletus is due to the same demand for metals which resulted in the Minoanization of the Cycladic islands. The city of Miletus, which sits on the Anatolian coast, shows a similar development as those on the Cycladic islands. Around the end of the Middle Minoan, there is a sudden influx of Minoan wares to the city. By the late Minoan 1A, most wares produced are Minoan in character. The Minoan weight system and script is incorporated into daily life, and Minoan cult items are found in various religious and cult contexts. Around the town, houses with Minoan architectural features are constructed, which might have functioned as administrative houses, similar to the villas of mainland Crete. It is difficult to know whether Miletus became a colony or just another node in the larger Minoan trade network, which happily incorporated various cultural aspects of their powerful neighbour, this to profit from the great Minoan demand of goods and resources. There is, however, some indication that Miletus might have become a Minoan colony around the late Minoan I period. Many ancient historians connected the origin of Miletus with Minos' brother Sarpedon, who like Minos was the son of Zeus and Europa. According to the retelling of Herodotus, the two brothers fought and Minos was victorious. Sarpedon was exiled from Crete along with his followers, among them his lover, the boy Miletus. In the version retold by Apollodorus of Rhodes, Sarpedon journeyed east to join in a war against the Lycians or Lycians, on the Anatolian coast. Once victorious, Sarpedon became king of the Lycians and founded the town of Miletus, naming it after his lover, although some stories have Miletus himself as the town's founder. These stories often have some kernel of truth, of course not all the time, but if Miletus would have come under Minoan influence, it would have been during the late Minoan I, as there is little contact before the Neopalatial period, and by the late Minoan II, the Minoan Neopalatial period was over. Towards the end of the late Minoan Ia, the Aegean Sea, from the Greek mainland to the Anatolian coast, was under economic and some political influence of the Minoans. However, in the center of this domain sits a dormant threat which hides below the island of Thera. No one who visits the island today would miss the great submerged caldera, the volcanic crater, which sits in the middle of the island. The fact that Thera was an active volcano was well known also by the Bronze Age inhabitants. The great caldera would have existed even during the times of the Minoans, along with a small central island. The island during the Bronze Age would have existed of a long continuous island running along the border of the caldera, except for a small inlet which allowed for access to the small crater lake. At some point in time during the late Minoan Ia, the inhabitants on Thera would have felt the ground shake. A great earthquake reaching a magnitude of 7 on the Richter scale, which would have been the precursor to the eruption. Just the earthquake itself would have resulted in destruction throughout the Aegean, and also resulted in the destruction of some parts of the city at Crete. Potentially even some deaths amongst the populace from the limited destruction. However, this would not have been an isolated event, but only a forewarning of things to come, as seismic activity increased in combination with the exhaust of smoke from the caldera. It seems as if many inhabitants evacuated the island before the eruption, as no bodies have been found beneath the ashes. It is also possible that those who left the island later returned, burying the remains of the deceased, but this seems less plausible. The inhabitants that left the island probably imagined themselves eventually returning to their home once the seismic activity had calmed down. This would not have been the first time the inhabitants would have experienced volcanic activity. Sadly, the extent of the destruction on the island inflicted by the eruption would make this an impossibility. Crete has often been described as the Pompeii of the Aegean, as the city would be covered by a layer of volcanic ash preserving the ruins, just like at Pompeii and Herculaneum. Comparing the eruption at Thera with the eruption at Vesuvius in 79 AD might indicate that the two are of comparable size. While both eruptions resulted in nearby towns and cities being covered in ash and magma, in terms of sheer force, the eruption at Thera dwarfs any other eruption around the Mediterranean going back tens of thousands of years. The total volume ejected from the eruption would have been 10 times that of Vesuvius. From ancient times until now, there are few eruptions which parallels the one on Thera. The great eruption on Mount Tambora in 1815 AD is classified as similar in size, and from what we know from that eruption, we can imagine how the people around the Aegean were impacted. When Tambora erupted in 1815 AD, the sheer amount of ashes and gases introduced into the atmosphere reduced the global temperature by nearly a degree Celsius, impacting even crops in America and Europe, leading to food shortages. The following year of 1816 AD is known as the year without a summer, since the average summer temperatures were around 2 to 3 degrees colder than average around Europe. For the inhabitants around the Aegean, the eruption at Thera would have been a cataclysmic event. The eruption would have been felt on Minoan sites across Crete, with the preceding and subsequent earthquakes reaping widespread destruction all over the island. Shortly after the eruption, the magma chamber started to empty and the caldera collapsed into the sea, generating a mega tsunami which reached the coast on Crete shortly after, devastating most coastal sites along the north coast. The waves have been hypothesized to reach up to 100 meters, penetrating deep into the Cretan mainland. Once the water had receded, ash would descend from the sky, creating an infertile layer which killed the crops below and rendered farming impossible. The small microscopic particles of ash, which now poisoned the air, would wreak havoc on the respiratory system of those unfortunate enough to come into contact with it, a serious health hazard which impacted many around the region. The column of ash and gases which rose from the eruption would enter into the stratosphere, dispersing small particles and gases which react in the atmosphere, creating a layer of aerosol which reflects sunlight and cools the climate. The extent of change in the climate due to the eruption is not known, but it is most possible that there could have been a form of volcanic winter, with cooler temperatures and changes in rainfall all around the globe. It is quite understandable that many initially saw the eruption on Thera as the source of the destruction of the Minoan civilization. However, the ceramics buried by the eruption on Akrotiri are late Minoan I wares, indicating that the eruption happened towards the end of the late Minoan I archaeological sequence. Since we know that the Minoan palaces of the Neopalatial were destroyed towards the end of the late Minoan IB period, the eruption at Thera was not the end of the Minoan civilization as was originally hypothesized. The Minoans were undoubtedly tenacious. However, the eruption was undoubtedly the beginning of the end. The question then became for many archaeologists, when did the eruption occur? We know that by the late Minoan II period, all the palaces except for Knossos were abandoned. But for how long after the eruption did the Neopalatial period remain? Basically, was the late Minoan IB period a short period of rapid decline or a long period of gradual decline? Before science-based dating, such as carbon dating, determining an absolute chronology was done through connecting imported and exported wares or even technologies to known dates of, for example, kings around the Near East and Egypt. However, the Neopalatial coincides with the second intermediate period around Egypt, when the Egyptian state, once again, broke into competing ruling groups around 1700 BC. And around 50 years later, the Hyksos people, probably a Semitic people from the Levant, migrated west, crossing the Sinai Peninsula, occupying Lower and Middle Egypt until the Hyksos were expelled by Ahmosis I around 1550 BC, ushering in the period of the New Kingdom. This chaotic period in Egypt's history has made the dating of the Neopalatial very difficult. No efforts at dating the eruption from an archaeological standpoint have been particularly convincing, although many attempts have been made. Some of these stone vases found amongst the rubble at Akrotiri have been identified by some as Egyptian stone vases from the 18th dynasty, which would indicate that the eruption took place at the earliest in the middle of the 16th century BC, so at the earliest around 1550 BC, but probably later. At Avaris in the middle of the Nile Delta, a fresco of Minoan style has been dated to the reign of Thutmose III, who ruled Egypt during the 18th dynasty between 1479 and 1425 BC. These frescoes show many similarities with some of the wall paintings found at Akrotiri according to some scholars, indicating that these paintings could have been from the early part of the late Minoan I period, basically before the eruption. These early efforts of using archaeological evidence put the date of the eruption at Thera sometimes around 1500 BC, a date that would indicate that the late Minoan I period was a long period of prosperity and the following post-eruption period of the late Minoan IB was short. Basically, that the Minoan civilization was brought to an end just shortly after the eruption. But evidence from Crete indicate that the connection between Crete and Egypt during the reign of Thutmose III corresponds to the late Minoan II period, a period characterized by Mycenaean control of the island. So when Thutmose III reigned in Egypt, the Neopalatial period seemed to have come to an end. Most scholars have historically, before the introduction of carbon dating, put the eruption sometime around 1550 BC, given the Egyptian connection. This means that the late Minoan 1b would have been a very short period, a form of belief in what has been termed a short chronology, a viewpoint that was held by most scholars until recently. It is really first towards the end of the 1980s and 1990s, results from various scientific methods indicated an earlier date for the eruption at Thera, opposing the view of a short chronology. The main effort to establish a reliable date of the eruption has been through radiocarbon dating, a scientific method which has become more reliable during the last few decades but still has some quirks and dissenters. At Akrotiri, seeds and plants from various storage jars buried beneath the pumice and ash from the eruption has given us a good insight into when Thera erupted. Radiocarbon dating from organic material on Thera, however, does not corroborate a short chronology. Instead, the evidence from radiocarbon dating indicates a date somewhere around the second half of the 17th century BC, somewhere between 1635 and 1605 BC. Initially, many archaeologists critiqued the result from radiocarbon dating, given that the method was still rather new. But with time, more results from radiocarbon dating corroborate the same dates. For example, ice core samples from Greenland also indicates a massive volcanic eruption around the second half of the 17th century BC. The result from scientific dating has shifted the view from a short late Minoan 1b period to a long chronology, a period lasting around a century and a half. It is quite clear now that the eruption on Thera probably didn't take place as late as 1550 BC. This means that the Minoans were able to recover from this destructive period and endure for more than a century after the advent of the eruption. The period after the eruption, the late Minoan 1b, was still by no means a period of slow decay. There seemed to have been a lot of prosperity. The Minoans managed to overcome much of the destruction brought about by the eruption. The palace at Phaistos was rebuilt, trade surged, and Minoan art and wares are exported far and wide throughout the eastern Mediterranean. New results from carbon dating are constantly being published, and the date of the eruption will move back and forth.